Zootopia 2 has come home to Disney+.
Let's go!
Get ready for a new case.
We're the greatest partners of all time!
New friends.
Gary the Snake.
And your last name?
The Snake.
Dream Team.
New habitats.
Zootopia has a secret reptile population.
You can watch the record-breaking phenomenon at home. Zootopia 2, now available on Disney+, rated PG. And right now you can get Disney Plus and Hulu for just $4.99 a month for 3 months with a special limited time offer. Ends March 24th. After 3 months, plan auto-renews at $12.99 a month. Terms apply.
If you're a podcast host, listen up, this one's for you. My name is Allie Jackson. I'm the host of Finding Mr. Height, a dating and relationship podcast that I've been doing for 4 years now, sharing my positive and practical approach to dating that's built on my own life experience. And I wanted to share another experience that I've had, my secret behind monetizing my show. It's called Red Circle, and I was just telling my colleague about how much I love their platform. With Red Circle, not only am I getting a seamless hosting experience, but I also love the support I receive in ad sales. It's not just typical ad sales either. It's targeted opportunities based on my show and my life. And the platform is super simple. You just set your preferences and Red Circle matches you with sponsors that align with your show. You can vet every opportunity and their platform gives you great analytics. More recently too, my Red Circle team has brought me opportunities outside of my podcast on social media to really augment the podcast partnerships, bring them full circle. I just can't recommend them enough. If you want to give it a try, go to redcircle.com to get your free trial. That's redcircle.com for a free trial.
Drink? Now, shall we begin? Hello, we are now in an age of nuclear uncertainty, as wars have broken out around the globe and great powers realign. Britain is apparently a nuclear power, but relies on the United States for its deterrent. And should the worst happen, would the Prime Minister really authorise a launch of the Trident missiles? And what about the number of nukes? There are over 10,000 in the world today, but should there be? Joining is David Holloway, author of Nuclear Weapons and International History, as we discuss the bombs in the 20th century and more recently, and I ask the questions that perhaps you always wanted to, such as, why are there so many of the damn things? Anyway, let's get on with it. David, thanks so much for joining me on this podcast. It's a very great pleasure to have you on.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm very glad to be here.
Well, I really did want to speak to you when I saw the title of your book, Nuclear Weapons and International History, and it's quite the subject. And I think this is building on work that you've done previously, is it not?
Yeah, that's right. Yes. I decided quite a while ago that it would be interesting to look at the history of the nuclear arms race, and in particular at the Soviet side, because so little had been written about that or had been known about it. And then in the 1980s, late 1980s, things began to open up there. It became possible to interview people and so on.
Yes.
Yeah.
That must have been an incredible time, actually.
It was amazing. I mean, I had been writing about East-West relations, about arms control, and, all that fairly relying on official statements. And then to meet the person who was Robert Oppenheimer's kind of counterpart in the Soviet Union, and to be invited out to their equivalent of Los Alamos twice, and to talk to people. It was, I couldn't believe it at the time. It was amazing. And looking back on it, I think, how did that happen? Yeah.
Yes, because growing up in the 1980s as I did, the prospect of nuclear Armageddon was very present. I think that we were constantly being told that there was a risk of nuclear war. And I wonder if this is something that maybe recently with the war in Ukraine, that's meant it's reared its head again. But do you get the sense in America, where you're based on, I would say it's the case here in the United Kingdom, that many people younger than myself are perhaps really aware of a nuclear threat at all, even though there are literally thousands of the things in various countries.
No, absolutely. I think maybe your generation or a somewhat older generation became much more concerned about climate change. And I remember once there was a group of doctoral students from other universities came to Stanford. I was asked to have lunch with them. And when I told them I was interested in nuclear things, they thought, why are you interested in that? The important thing is climate change. That's what we're facing, and that's what we have to deal with. But the nuclear danger kind of raises its head every now and again, and then there's a period of calm. I think after the Cold War, there was the hope that really, well, there were large reductions in the numbers of forces, but there was a hope that a kind of order had been created that would somehow manage the nuclear relationships and nuclear weapons. Um, Even though and there were hopes also that somehow you could create a world without nuclear weapons. But of course, all of that has gone by the board in the last few years. And now it looks much more dangerous. We look as though we're entering a new phase, a new period in international history, but in nuclear history as well. And the dangers are not entirely clear, especially dangers of new technologies and so on. So it's a very different, I think, a very different world to try to understand now.
Yes, I think that one of the reasons why I wanted to speak to you about the history of nuclear weapons is I wanted to get out some rather dumb questions first, and then we can get on to some more interesting things. But growing up, and I don't think I ever really got a kind of answer to it, but I always wondered, why do you need more than, say, 20, 25 nuclear weapons? Because throughout the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the United States were just sort of piling up vast numbers. And I could never understand why you need more than enough to destroy the entire planet.
Well, it is a good question, and we did get to very high numbers. In the mid 80s, the number of nuclear warheads in the world was 70,000. We're now down to about 12,000. That's still a lot more than the 20 you're asking about. But yes, the US was in the lead, of course, and it began slowly after the war to produce nuclear weapons. But then, as the Cold War intensified, production became more rapid, and the US built up to over 20,000 by 1960. And the Soviet Union followed. And what the US had, the Soviet Union felt it should have too. But by 1960, the Soviet stockpile was about 10% the size of the US. But then, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet Union decided it really had to attain parity or even superiority in thinking in terms of numbers over the United States in order to be able to talk to the US as an equal or to be treated by the US as an equal. And so, and the other thing is that when you got reconnaissance satellites, which could fly overhead and could identify targets, they produce far more targets that you would want to hit in a war, not only the enemy nuclear weapons, the missile silos or the bomber fields, the airfields, but also command and control installations, the industry. You wanted to destroy the country's industry. So you got huge lists of targets that were produced that really made sense when you thought about them very narrowly. Oh, yes, we want to destroy this, and maybe we need two weapons to destroy that. So there was a dynamic that somehow separated it. It turned in on itself a little bit. But there are other answers to the question you raise. Why do you need more than 10 or 20 or 25 nuclear weapons? Well, their calculations were done on World War II. What was, strategic bombing by Britain and the US during World War II is probably killed 600,000 people in Germany. And after the war, scientists like, well, Patrick Blackett did some calculations about what would have been the equivalent in terms of um, atomic bombs. And it would have been certainly over 200, maybe as high as 300. So the damage done in Germany by strategic bombing didn't win the war. It contributed to obviously to winning the war. So that meant you had maybe 300 nuclear weapons, which would, not end a war. So that gets you up over 25. It doesn't get you to 70,000, I mean 20,000. But there was a kind of rationale. And then you're just producing the weapons. So you just go on producing them somehow.
Yes. Presumably, once you've produced a set of weapons, they have a sell by date.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
then, I mean, presumably, particularly, I guess, I know the Soviets tend to keep hold of them for a little bit longer than the Americans do.
Yes. So there was a constant process of trying to improve the weapons design so they would be safer to handle, that they would be more accurate when you're trying to strike targets, and also more efficient in the use of fissile material, which meant you had more of that to build more weapons. And both countries, the US more than the Soviet Union in the end, did tests in the atmosphere to test the new weapons designs. And that also, so the whole process of improving the weapons and then testing them, um, that dominated the 1950s and into the early 60s. And also, of course, the transition from the atomic bomb or the fission bomb to the fusion bomb, the thermonuclear weapons. So, one of the first tests conducted by the US in the South Pacific produced a yield of 15 megatons. In other words, more than 1,000 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. So, I mean, that's just a fantastic increase in destructive capacity. And somehow the US developed that, and then Soviet Union felt it had to have it too. So there's quite a strong mimetic element in the arms race.
So you mentioned testing, and I again have I think a stupid question, which is that I've never really understood the testing because you test your nuclear bomb and it blows up, so you know it's going to blow up, but I mean, it's blown up, so you can't use it anymore.
Yeah,
So I know that it's not like a photocopy and just produces whoever's producing the nuclear bombs. So I fail to see the point of testing them if you because it's used. I know
well,
it
because
sounds very stupid, so forgive me.
no, it's not stupid, but it relates to your initial question about why do you need so many bombs? You need bombs to test. The US conducted over a thousand, about 1,000 nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere. Well, so that's 1,000 test weapons. And then, of course, you're testing a particular design. So you're producing the bombs of that design to be used in the case of a war.
Right. Okay, so one element to a nuclear power is it's very important for mutually assured destruction that you declare that you have a nuclear program and capable of producing weapons.
Mm.
But there are, I mean, particularly Israel, I think, has never declared it has weapons. And has Pakistan declared that it has weapons?
Yes,
Oh, it
yes,
has.
yeah,
But Israel hasn't
that's right.
for different reasons, I suspect. But what's the thinking as to why you wouldn't say you have them? Because I think that will be the only power that hasn't said it has them.
Well, there would be reasons why, while you initially building the weapons to say that you don't have them or you don't have a program because that will look like a provocation and you're vulnerable. Somebody might think, well, we should attack them before they get the weapons, not after they have the weapons. I mean, look what's going on in Iran at the moment. And I think the Israeli, yes, nobody questions that Israel has nuclear weapons. And the position they take is that they will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East. And that's a rather ambiguous statement. But one meaning of it is we won't test. We won't be the first to use them, or, it can be read in different ways. And that particular formulation came out of discussions between Israel and the US, where the Kennedy administration was really trying to stop the Israeli nuclear program. And Israel was actually deceiving the US about what it had and what it was doing. And then in a meeting, Shimon Peres said, "Yeah, we will never be the first to introduce the nuclear weapons." And then there was a secret conversation between Richard Nixon and Golda Meir, the Israeli prime minister, in what was it, 1969, which we don't have a record of, but everyone thinks that what was said was Nixon said, "We won't press you to sign the non-proliferation treaty." I mean, that was a big issue, actually, between the US and Israel, especially under Kennedy. And Golda Meir said, "Okay, we won't embarrass you, by testing or showing off that we have the weapons." So it's an odd situation, like quantum mechanics. The bomb both exists and doesn't exist, but really it exists.
But that's very interesting because presumably there's a practical problem for Israel. And I don't want to linger too long on Israel, but there's a practical issue they have in that Israel's a very small country. Where could they test even if they wanted to?
Well, there was an incident, it's called, in 1979, called the Vela incident, where US reconnaissance satellites that, were up there looking for tests or monitoring tests, picked up a signature from a test in I think in the South Pacific or in the Indian Ocean. And there's always been controversy. It was clear there was some kind of cooperation between Israel and South Africa on this. And the question is, was there a test? And if so, what was being tested? Was it an Israeli test? Or was it a South African test with some Israeli help? And that's remains still a bit of a mystery, although I think it's generally accepted among people in the field who study this that it was a nuclear test, but exactly a nuclear test of what and for whom remains a little bit unclear. So
And
that
also,
could have been that could have been an Israeli attempt to test, even though to test in Israel would be uh, very hard.
yes, yes. I mean, impossible, presumably.
Well, you could do it, but with a very low yield test, I guess. But then, it would be picked up, and that would very likely trigger more serious efforts by other Middle Eastern countries to develop the bomb.
Yes, undoubtedly. So, just looking a little bit at espionage, which I know you write about, and that's very interesting. Now, there's a probably best known spy involved in the nuclear program in the United States, Klaus Fuchs. And so, how effective was he in that? I think during the same period, you have the Cambridge spies, and they're always talked about as, you know, these hugely successful spies for the Soviets. But really, Klaus Fuchs does he kind of rather overshadow them in the sort of big stakes element to spying?
He overshadows them in relation to nuclear espionage because he was in the he was part of the British delegation or mission to the Manhattan Project. So from the end of 1944, he was at Los Alamos in the theoretical division. You know, so really looking at the design of a bomb, and in particular a problem which arose at Los Alamos that caused a lot of problems, which is the Los Alamos knew how to design a bomb with highly enriched uranium. But they also knew that plutonium was fissile, but it couldn't be used in the same way because there's a specific feature of one of the isotopes called spontaneous fission. You can't bring them together quickly enough. The explosion, there'll be a fizzle. You won't get a real explosion. So Los Alamos, from I think the middle of 1944, was really focused on this problem. How do you design for a plutonium bomb? And that was the information that Fuchs passed. First of all, that there was the problem with spontaneous fission, and then secondly, giving indications of, you know, how it had been resolved. And that was very important for the Soviet effort. They'd already set up a project to develop the bomb because it alerted them to this problem and pointed to particular directions that could be taken in dealing with it. And I did talk to the Soviet Oppenheimer, a man called Yuli Khariton, and he said, yes, Fuchs had been important for them.
Wow. Amazing. From the horse's mouth. Yeah.
Yeah.
So another element of espionage, a little bit more recent, which has really fascinated me, which is the US and Israeli efforts against Iran and the Stuxnet. I think,
Yeah.
am I saying that right? Which I guess I'm mostly informed by watching a documentary about this. This is a sort of a software program installed by presumably an agent in the nuclear program in Iran. But as far as I understand it, it was actually counterproductive in that the Iranian program increased its sort of productivity in the following months and years after the Stuxnet attack, which I think is around about 2010. Is that right?
About that, but no, that was a very significant operation. But I think one of the things is you're never quite sure what the impact, of knowledge will be and how people will react to something like Stuxnet, right? So the Iranians did discover it, right? It was a problem for them, and then they had to deal with that. But it also, the striking thing is how information, as it were, flows around the world. I mean, that's one of the things that really struck me. So we think, in Britain, the Maud Committee in 1940, set up in 1940, looked at the possibility of a bomb. And that report was then briefed to the US and by some accounts quite important in the setting up of the Manhattan Project. But it also went to Moscow because there was a man in one of the Cambridge Five, actually, Cairncross, who passed it on. But of course, when it arrived in Moscow at the end of 1941, the Wehrmacht was at the gates of Moscow, so a bomb that you could build in 3 years didn't seem very important. You had to survive the next 3 years, and it's only then later when some information is picked up about in the Soviet Union about a German effort on the bomb. that they set up a small project in September 1942. So that's a very important, kind of crucial piece of intelligence. And then the intelligence, technical intelligence from tests and from um, reconnaissance satellites, how many weapons have you deployed and so on. All of that became really central to the effort to have arms control because you could begin to monitor and verify whether people were, abiding by the agreements that they had signed. Intelligence is absolutely crucial in this history. Yeah.
Yes, it's completely interwoven throughout.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, one great failure of US intelligence was that after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet leadership, which had far fewer systems, missile systems or bombers than the US, decided that it would have to attain parity with the US or even superiority. And so there was a very big effort to build up Soviet missile forces in particular. The bomber technology wasn't on quite the same level. And but the US didn't pick that up. It's one of the, and then late in 79, 80, you have people saying, oh, look, the Soviet Union's built up far more than we expected, and they're going for victory. And that was a failure, I think, on both kinds of to miss the build-up and then to exaggerate it and draw very kind of far-reaching conclusions from it. So that too is an aspect of that was a failure of intelligence on the US part. I mean, they had the satellites, they saw what was being done, but they failed. I mean, there were people in the CIA who had a grasp on what was going on, but the national intelligence estimates said no, they're not really catching up with this.
That's interesting because I think you also write about close run things.
Yeah,
Um, and obviously, Cuba, that leaps out as one.
yeah,
The CIA was quite effective at uncovering that particular the buildup of equipment on the island of Cuba. But was that, and I suspect I might know the answer, but was that the closest we ever came to a nuclear war? I remember my father was in the army in Germany, in Berlin, I think, and they were preparing for war.
yeah. No, I think it's generally agreed that was the closest we came to a nuclear war, and that's comes through on the Soviet sources. I mean, the documents now available, and indeed from their own writing. Yeah, that was the really dangerous period, and it had it. I think both Kennedy and Khrushchev drew from it the conclusion that they should not in future get themselves into that kind of situation. And the Kennedy writes to Khrushchev at one point about, we share this responsibility for peace in the world. We have to avoid that. And that was very much Khrushchev's view too, although Khrushchev was more willing, I think, to push things, as in Cuba, to try to do something, and then was very taken aback by the rather strong American reaction.
Well, I was what I've done in the past on another podcast was discussing films
Yeah,
and involving submarines. And certainly any film made during in the nuclear era, there's always a submarine captain who thinks he might have to fire off a couple of nuclear weapons because the communication always gets broken and
yeah,
they have to make up their own minds. But with Britain's nuclear deterrent, nuclear submarine based solely, presumably the reason why we have that is because it's in a submarine, it can go anywhere in the world underwater. So we can have our extent of our we can reach an enemy from almost anywhere. Our nuclear deterrent isn't independent, is it? We're heavily reliant on the Americans. Is that right?
Yes, heavily reliant in terms of, I mean, when the Polaris deal was done in 1962, which is has been the basis for this arrangement. Yes, help with the design of the submarines and help, and also I won't say just help, but very close cooperation on the design of warheads and missiles. And that means that if there were to be a break, I mean, I don't know the details of that particular arrangement now, but if there were to be a break, then that would be a serious problem for Britain. It would force a decision about what to continue. Um, because in a way, the submarines, the continuous at sea deterrent, is a kind of classic deterrence. It really only would make sense. Well, uh, it would seem that it would only make sense to use it in retaliation. You wouldn't attack, say, the Soviet Union or Russia, which has far more weapons with what you have on one submarine. But on the other hand, if Britain is attacked with nuclear weapons, there's the question, does it then, has it failed in its deterrent role? And does it make sense to launch it? And there's the so-called famous letter from the Prime Minister that the submarine commander would have to open up and, what's the proper response now? And that, that's nuclear deterrence in that way has a lot of strange paradoxes, I think, in it. And that's one. You have if you have it to deter, and you deter by the threat of retaliation. But if you are attacked, then deterrence has failed. Does it make sense just to let off and kill thousands, tens of thousands of people just because your deterrent failed?
Indeed, this is interesting because I guess for a certain cohort in this country, having our own nuclear bomb is a source of, I guess, some national pride. But
Yeah.
it does seem increasingly that a nation of our size, and France, France, I think, is a little bit more independent. Is that right? They
Yeah.
don't, they're not.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. So, but even with that independence, is there actually any point in countries like Britain and France having a nuclear capability, given the points you've just mentioned?
Well, one of the arguments for France and for Britain to have their own nuclear force was a kind of residual doubt about whether uh, you could rely on the US when it came to it, to act. And in Britain, there was often, reference to 1940. US didn't come into World War II until, 2 years after Britain was in. And for the French too, de Gaulle in particular was very insistent on French independence and self-sufficiency. Um, uh, but of course, those were not, I mean, they do come up, and I do discuss those kinds of points where de Gaulle and Macmillan talk, and de Gaulle and Adenauer talk, and about, can you rely on the Americans? And but that was very much in the background. But of course, it's come right to the foreground now in the last year under the Trump administration about does Article 5 mean anything now? And so we begin to get talk about um, between Germany, France, and indeed Britain about, okay, so what do you think now about nuclear weapons as a deterrent against Russia if you're not sure about what the US would do if Russia decided to attack? So that's a kind of odd twist in a way to the history that's come to the fore in a way. It was always a kind of submerged issue. I mean, Nixon at one point said and I quoted in the book that yeah, this nuclear guarantee to Europe is a load of crap. So
Yes, it's
yeah,
interesting you say that because there was a war game broadcast here where former ministers in the government, so, and relatively recently as well. I think the defense secretary, they were playing various roles, but the former defense secretary played the prime minister in a, and it had been very well war gamed out. They'd had, military people and people in the MOD had thought very long and hard about nuclear. About war in Europe and things like that. And the scenario was sort of Russian provocative attacks to Britain, but nothing nuclear.
Yeah.
And what was extremely worrying was the first thing that the ministers sort of went to was, right, what should we do with our nuclear weapons? And that was extremely concerning, listening to people who should really know better, because I mean, I don't think that's a realistic avenue to
No.
go down, to start firing off nuclear weapons because of Russian provocation. But that was the
No.
first thing they raised in this war
Yeah.
game.
No,
Crazy.
I think that so they do plan. I mean, we talk about deterrence, and so deterrence is well, it's become a very important concept, right, in nuclear issues. But of course, deterrence, countries that have nuclear weapons also plan to use them. You know, I don't think any country would say, okay, these are dummy missiles that are there, that'll just keep people away and make them behave themselves. But so yes, they think, but I think responding to a conventional attack with nuclear weapons opens it up to Russia to use its much bigger force of nuclear weapons against Britain. I mean, that would seem uh, curious. And you'd have to think that, or you'd have to count on the fact that a nuclear response to a conventional attack would indicate that would make Russia think again that they wouldn't want to have any kind of nuclear uh, weapons landing on Russian territory. So I think that's one of the areas where there would be an extremely tricky, well, I shouldn't say tricky. If you were really trying to think through whether to use nuclear weapons, you're having to make a calculation about what the Russian response would be. But in fact, NATO doctrine from the beginning was that in response to a conventional attack by the Soviet Union, all that NATO had, all that Western Europe had, was essentially US American nuclear weapons to respond. And that was the doctrine right through to the late 60s, when you get the adoption of, when you get the realization that responding immediately with nuclear weapons to a conventional attack is dangerous. You really need to be able to respond conventionally, and then there may be escalation, but you have to be able somehow to threaten escalation, but not just loose off the nuclear weapons initially. So I'm surprised. I'd like to see that program, maybe.
I'll send it to you. Yeah, I'll share it
Oh,
to
oh,
you.
that would be great. Yeah,
Yeah,
no,
yeah, it's absolutely mind-boggling that almost the first thing they mentioned. It was I get the sense that these ministers have been making decisions to spend billions on these programs. So you think, oh, this is a chance to have a go, use the bloody thing. Um, Another close run thing I think that I wanted to ask you about was, I think there was one that also involved submarines in 1983, I think. Is that right?
well, in 1983 there was a NATO exercise, Able Archer, which was actually a command post exercise. It didn't, but that didn't involve uh, that was mainly land forces, and the Soviet Union then took certain actions, which later, after the NATO exercise, people looked at them and thought, oh, did the Soviet Union fear that we were about to launch an attack on them? And were they preparing a preemptive strike against us, because they feared we would attack? I do go into that in the book, and I think it was a dangerous period because there were great tensions over the deployment of the Pershing II missiles and the ground-launched cruise missiles in Europe on NATO's part in response to a Soviet deployment of medium-range SS-20 missiles for Europe. I mean, so there was that crisis, and it's true the Soviet Union was worried about what NATO was doing. But it wasn't submarines, but there was this, and there is this official report that was done in the US by the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, which concluded some years after this incident that in fact maybe we had been very close to nuclear war. I'm inclined to think, actually partly after talking to some Russians, that it wasn't that close, but it was dangerous. There was a danger of misunderstanding. It's quite a complex story, but a danger of misunderstanding on one side or the other, that the other was, about to launch an attack. And so that means even when you had maybe over 10,000 strategic warheads on either side, you could get into a situation where afterwards you weren't sure how close you were to nuclear war.
Yes, it's a frightening thought. I suppose communication is the most important thing for our leaders to have, a relationship where they're communicating, and hopefully a copy of your book to hand to make sure they don't make or carry on. I guess we haven't had one yet, well, apart from Japan, of course, but no sort of exchange of nuclear weapons. Are you optimistic for the future?
I waver between optimism and pessimism. I think I think I'm rather pessimistic at the moment because when I look back to the end of the Cold War and the reductions in nuclear forces since then, and the sense, as you mentioned earlier, that you didn't have to worry about that. It was being dealt with. People understood the problem. It was being dealt with to some degree. But now I think, the treaties, the New START treaty has gone, the non-proliferation treaty is in difficulty. You have you have Poland, discussing whether it really needs its own nuclear weapons. And Japan, who does Japan rely on now? It both had an anti-nuclear policy, but it relied on US nuclear cover for dealing with China and Russia. So what will Japan do? And I'm afraid that we're not seeing the kind of dialogue that I think we really do need among the nuclear powers, and especially the big three now, China as well as Russia and the US. And that I think is worrying. And part of what I wanted to do in the book was to show basically how people had thought about nuclear weapons since Hiroshima and had tried to deal with them, tried to get international control. That failed. Then deterrence, then developing more weapons. But also what was very important, I think, was that from the mid-50s, when the thermonuclear weapons were tested, the political leaders on both sides understood that a nuclear war would be a catastrophe and was to be avoided, even while they had their military kind of plan for such a war.
Well, one hopes this is still in the minds of our leaders today. But David, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation.
Okay.
I really appreciate your time. And for listeners, the link for nuclear weapons, not nuclear, got that on the mind, nuclear weapons in international history in the show notes. But David, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Oliver.
We've come to the end of this club meeting, so thank you for listening. If you want to get in touch about club benefits, please do, either by email or on X or Instagram. Links are in the show notes. I've also included my Substack link so members can read articles I've written on various matters that may be of interest. The History Book Club is written and presented by me, Oliver Webb-Carter. Music is by listener Chat DMZ. Episodes continue next week and every week, so please do join, subscribe, and if you can provide the club with a 5-star rating, we would be delighted. In the meantime, I thank you again, and now I have to usher members out into the real world. Until next time.
I was
If you're a podcast host, listen up. This one's for you. My name is Allie Jackson. I'm the host of Finding Mr. Height, a dating and relationship podcast that I've been doing for 4 years now, sharing my positive and practical approach to dating that's built on my own life experience. And I wanted to share another experience that I've had, my secret behind monetizing my show. It's called Red Circle. And I was just telling my colleague about how much I love their platform. With Red Circle, not only am I getting a seamless hosting experience, but I also love the support I receive in ad sales. It's not just typical ad sales either. It's targeted opportunities based on my show and my life. And the platform is super simple. You just set your preferences and Red Circle matches you with sponsors that align with your show. You can vet every opportunity and their platform gives you great analytics. More recently too, my Red Circle team has brought me opportunities outside of my podcast on social media to really augment the podcast partnerships, bring them full circle. I just can't recommend them enough. If you want to give it a try, go to redcircle.com to get your free trial. That's redcircle.com for a free trial. If you're a podcast host, listen up. This one's for you. My name is Allie Jackson. I'm the host of Finding Mr. Height, a dating and relationship podcast that I've been doing for 4 years now, sharing my positive and practical approach to dating that's built on my own life experience. And I wanted to share another experience that I've had, my secret behind monetizing my show. It's called Red Circle. And I was just telling my colleague about how much I love their platform. With Red Circle, not only am I getting a seamless hosting experience, but I also love the support I receive in ad sales. It's not just typical ad sales either. It's targeted opportunities based on my show and my life. And the platform is super simple. You just set your preferences and Red Circle matches you with sponsors that align with your show. You can vet every opportunity and their platform gives you great analytics. More recently too, my Red Circle team has brought me opportunities outside of my podcast on social media to really augment the podcast partnerships, bring them full circle. I just can't recommend them enough. If you want to give it a try, go to redcircle.com to get your free trial. That's redcircle.com for a free trial.